One of the things that I've always looked at is that, I've gone to several train shows, lots of train shows, seen many a wonderful layout. And the one thing that always kind of jumps out at me is it may be a wonderfully beautiful layout, but you start looking and the buildings are all plastic, basically complete new out of the box plastic. The other thing that is very apparent, you see these buildings with a light on the bottom floor and you can see it from the top floor. Things like that really take away from the overall look of the layout. I put together a little presentation on doing some kit bashing and building better buildings. And some of these techniques are incredibly simple. I would encourage you all to take a look and see what you think. Here's 2 Atlas water tanks. The one on the right is simply out of the box, and the one on the left has just simply been painted. It still has to be weathered, but it's definitely a difference for your layout. The other thing obviously would be to put ground cover on the base, blend it in with the current ground cover in its location. Tools for these projects, virtually everything you can come up with. A sharp X-Acto knife, nippers, sanding blocks, sanding sticks, a hand square, an assembly jig, and of course assembly jigs can come in all shapes and sizes, and you may probably already have one, which is great. Weights, clamps, rubber bands, generic cheap spray paint. I can't emphasize that enough. Generic cheap spray paint. Plastic filler acrylic paints such as these, and a natural spun and solvent cement. These are all basic tools. I put together a list of general suggestions just to give you a bit of a need to do or must do or suggested to do. Cut parts off the sprues using your nippers, cutters, X-Acto knife, whatever, but don't break them off. It'll leave a stress mark on the plastic. Remove flash before painting, sand the joints, check for squareness often. Use blue painter tapes to hold small parts for painting. I use basic painting sticks, long painting sticks, wrap blue tape around it and stick the small parts to it, and then spray it using that, and it doesn't fall off and you don't lose anything. Paint everything. There should not be a piece of shiny plastic on your building. That'll destroy any look you want to accomplish. Another idea is if you're going to light the buildings, paint the interior of the walls black. And then if you are continuing on, you paint the outside walls too. That allows you to light certain parts of the building or all of the building and not have a glowing wall, brick wall, which I've seen before. Use black construction paper for a view block. It really destroys the look of things when you look from the top floor on the front to the bottom floor on the back. It's very easy. I'll show you later about this black construction paper view block. Curtains or shades in the windows is a must. You can paint shades, you can paint curtains, or you can just simply use a paper printed curtains for your windows. Before you glue, test fit all your joints to make sure you've got a great joint and it's square, depending on whether it's an inside or an outside joint. Don't forget little details, roof details, awnings, figures, etc. Dry transfer signs in the windows can hide the lack of interior of your buildings, but it can also just highlight what your building is there for. Don't be afraid to combine parts from other kits. Make yours unique, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. Redistribute walls for unique structure. Everybody's got lots of kits, or they have access to a lot of different kits, but they all have a tendency to look the same. How to change that to make it your own. I've done things like stacking walls vertically, front and back walls, and put them on top of each other to make a taller building. Extend walls horizontally. It's a square, but you open them up and you've got a long building like this Shaw Equipment manufacturing here. This is a Helgen building, and it's just simply extended along and goes around the corner. Invert the corners. The lower left picture in your screen is a building that I inverted the corners. So it's an inside corner, not an outside corner. Also, you can create overhangs with supports. You can have a track that goes under the building if you bring it out over the track and then have supports along to support that over the track. You can shorten walls, and again, feel free to combine kits. The other option is modular kits. There's a ton of different modular kits on the market. This is a Belvedere hotel. The reason I have this is I built a 2-foot by 18-foot switching layout, and I had a building that I built out of 2 of these. It was fantastic. I had styrene strips to go in between, like the building walls, but I extended it and then went back into the backdrop. But the bottom level was against the backdrop itself, and then I had supports going out, and the track was underneath the building. What a fantastic structure that was. And I actually have the pieces to do another one for my next portion of the layout. Other modular manufacturers are Walthers, and of course, design preservation models. These are examples of how I've used those modular construction pieces in some of my buildings on the layout. Again, the bottom one is the Helgen Shaw equipment. Up here in the left, upper left, is cast and sheet metal. It is a DPM building that has been created using multiple pieces from their modular kit. And then another DPM building is Shores Industries. Fire escapes are from Tichy Train Group. And then another couple of examples, the upper left is City Classics. It's a combination of a couple of different factories. This is Pacific Packaging and Crate. This has been an older building that I use different techniques on, and I'll talk about that in a while. This is new. This is a DPM modular freight station, and I use different techniques on this one than this. And the roofing is kind of unique too, so I'll talk about that a little later. Walthers has a whole line of modular kits. This is Stoll Photography, good friend of mine, and somebody who's contributed greatly to my layout is Scott Stoll. He's on the clinic tonight. This is in honor of him and the work he's done in the layout. And he has a history in photography. So this is his factory. And you know what? Even Tyco, many of you take a good look at this and you will recognize this building. Years ago, I created this building for the Tacoma Clinic, Brig and Bragg, and won first prize. It's very simple, taking inside and outside corners and creating a nice, unique building with a very inexpensive kit. I'm going to take you through some of the steps I did to create a unique building. This is Middlesex Manufacturing from Atlas. It was an inexpensive building at the time, and I've had it for a long time, and then I decided I needed to do something with it. So this is what I did. I photocopied the kit walls. Photocopies are great for planning your cuts and your distances on the building sides and corners. I've used foam cores as a mock-up on several different buildings. I make adjustments to the mock-up while it's still a mock-up before I actually do the cutting of the actual kit, because it will save you a lot of heartache and money if you do that first. Also, when you do cut vertically, you need to plan a waste course of brick at each cut and then sand it smooth so that you don't have half a brick and half a brick joining itself. And that's just something I learned the hard way. So glue the edges and then add styrene bracing and then use squadron putty to fill any gaps. So my mock-ups allowed me to view the finished building before I actually built it. What was nice is, if you see right here on the left side of Pyramid Brewing, this was Dixon's mock-up, which I'm using that kit I just described as its building. So this was the mock-up, but you can see that Pyramid Brewing, and it became Diamond Brewing, but it actually worked out really well to kind of determine, will it fit? Does it do what I want it to do? These two buildings were originally this one was 2 stories taller, and the Dixon was a story taller, or actually 2 stories taller. And they blocked the future city of Cloverdale, which was going to be back here on a hill. So I shortened them both, and this is what we ended up with on Diamond Brewery. Use nippers or flush cutters for removing parts from the sprues. Then use a sanding stick to smooth any leftover flash. Before you ever glue anything, make sure that everything's smooth and even. If you're going to shorten the walls, again, cut along a mortar line. It's easier that way. And then plan a waste mortar line for sanding. You can see that I've cut the top level off, and then I end up cutting this entire a section off. The reason I did that is so that I still have the corbel on top when I attach the bottom two and this one. So sanding the edges of the buildings is important. To always use some kind of block of wood, square, or a true sander to keep the edge straight. It's very easy to push down too hard on one end or the other, and then you've got a lopsided wall. So always check often to ensure that it's straight and square. This is the rejoined walls. This is actually the bottom, and this is the very top floor with the two middle floors taken out. When you get to this, you use a plastic welding cement and then brace it with styrene so it's nice and sturdy. Also, again, this is the inside corner that I created. And when you're done, make sure you fill the gaps with squadron putty. And I do that by protecting the surrounding wall with Scotch tape so that just the seam I'm going to put the squadron putty in is visible. That saves you from trying to clean up a bunch of bricks from the squadron putty. Scribe your mortar lines if you do have an overspill of squadron putty with a dull X-Acto blade. And then again, brace walls. Here's a piece of styrene turned on side so that it stiffens that wall along there. You see the vertical ones here that are painted black. And then use City Classic. These are City Classic corner braces. These are wonderful because you can do both an inside corner and an outside corner. They work extremely well for supporting your building efforts. I call this 8 painting, and it's basically always paint everything. Everything you're going to put on this building, you paint, whether it's a black interior, a flat primer, wall color, a brick color, and alternatives. Use muted colors when possible. You seldom see any shiny surfaces, especially when they're weathered. I always use a wash for brick mortar. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then I use dull coat over the last batch of weathering. The window glazing is always last. I use a vertical wash of thin black acrylic on the back, and I spelled acrylic wrong, my apologies. And then dull coat inside for frosted windows so that the outside still reflects light. And then again, the black view block inside the buildings. So here's the structure prior to assembly. I've painted the exterior walls, the tan color, and the interior walls I paint first with black. That'll again allow any lighting inside the building not to show through and have glowing brick walls when you do so. Also, signs are important at this stage because you've got a nice flat surface before you put the building together. Signs are good. You've got computer and photocopier and decal paper you can use. If you're using decals, gloss coat the walls before you adhere your decals. You can make your own again. Dull coat the walls if you're using dry transfers, and then seal once they're dry before assembly. Other sign options, there's tons of sign options out there for your buildings. Ghost signs are these on the right-hand side. These are called ghost signs. They're basically photographs of building painting signs that are weathered and have been on the sides of brick buildings. Also BarMills and City Classics. And then of course you can make your own with your own computer as well. So these are the finished walls. After the decals have been put on, the window castings are in and the window glazing is in. And now it's ready for assembly. Just a hint, when adding window glass, do not use CA. It will haze the windows and probably most likely ruin the look of your building. So use gallery glass or canopy glue. If it's plastic to plastic, you can get away with using solvent cement. So this is where I streak the back of the windows with black thinned acrylic paint. It just gives a weathered look to the outside and it doesn't deter from the window reflecting light. You can use paper or paint for the window shades. I've used both, cutting just construction paper or a notebook pad that I've cut into pieces and taped on the backside or glued on the backside. I've also taken white acrylic paint, gone vertically on each side of the window so it looks like curtains, and that's provided a pretty good effect as well. Then as far as assembling your structure, using a gluing jig or a square is really imperative. You're going to end up not regretting these crazy joints that you might get when things are a little off kilter. This is a gluing jig from Micromark. There's as many gluing jigs as you can think of. Even a hand square is a good idea. So this is the final product. This is Dixon Fruit and Produce Company. One of my best friends and teammates from high school is actually in the fruit business. So I built this in honor of him. And you can see what I've done here. I've created an inside corner and then an overhang roof for a loading dock so that I've got not only an opportunity to load reefers here, but also here as well. And then of course I've got things on the roof like little vents, air conditioning, things like that, that always make a better model. Here's the view block I was talking about. You basically take black construction paper, cut it to the width from corner to corner and 2 pieces, and then cut it down the middle so you form an X. This becomes your view block in your buildings, especially if you're not going to put an interior in them. So your roofs are just as important as anything. Most people view your layout from above, unless you're fortunate to have everything at eye level, which most people aren't. Pick your roof treatment. There's so many different ways to go here. You can use just simply black paint. You can glue on a piece of fine grit sandpaper and paint it black or gray. You can use tissue paper for rolled roofing. There are multiple different manufacturers of commercial roofing materials. There's rusted tin roofing. There's old weathered cedar siding, etc. There's all sorts of stuff you can get. And even masking tape. I've used masking tape overlapped and then painted black and weathered as a roof treatment. And then always use either balsa or styrene strip to keep the roof at the chosen height. And then mix it up. Don't forget to weather the roof. This is a technique I've learned that basically you take black construction paper, full sheet, paint it with gray paint, cut it into strips, and then sand the edges, one edge. You sand the edge so that it appears that it's weathered and torn and aged. And then you simply glue it on. This is an old shake roof that's underneath the rolled roofing. And again, it's weathered, and then you put the rolled roofing over the top so it looks like it's torn away from the underlayment, which is now the shake roof. And that's just a DPM freight house. So here's again more suggestions for roof and wall detail. Access doors, all these roofs should have an access door. Vents, chimneys, gas meters on the side of the buildings, air conditioners either on top or out of a window, piping, whether it be a downspout or other piping. Skylights, you can use skylights in here. Water tanks in the 50s, a lot of water tanks were on top of buildings for fire. Anything else you really want to put up there. I've got one, it's a Woodland Scenics figure set that's a roofing crew, and they're putting on a new roof to one of my buildings. No matter how careful you are, you will probably eventually have a joint that's not quite up to snuff. It might be too wide, it might be cockeyed, anyhow. Use squadron putty to start with. If that doesn't really hide it, then use pipes or downspouts over the affecting joint or the offending joint. And then if it's really bad, then you use vines or decals, and both work just fine. So weathering. This is probably one of the most important steps you can take in making your building really stand out as a model, not just a toy. In the past, this building at the bottom, I used colored pencils to color individual bricks. You can imagine how long that took, but I actually did color individual bricks before I used mortar wash. But what I've done lately, and you can see this upper left portion of the building. I'll hold that up for a second. So what I did with that is I used, here we go, basic spray paint, just cheap stuff, spray the entire wall. Then I come back with acrylic paints. And so I start with yellow ochre, and I use a sponge, and I basically sponge on the color, alternating and rotating my hand so there's no pattern. Then I go to the next lighter color, which is burnt sienna, okay, burnt sienna. And I do the same thing all over the wall. And then I go to this heritage brick color, and I spend a little extra paint on the wall for this. And then finally, I do a burnt umber. And burnt umber is just really a dark brown. Very mottled look, but it gives you the view of various brick colors on the wall. So once that dries, then I take basic joint compound, okay? Basic joint compound, mix it with a dark gray acrylic paint and a little water, and I use that for the mortar on the wall. And I spread it with a brush. I take a wet paper towel and wipe it vertically. And then as I get it all cleaned out, then I take my thumb, wet it, and again, vertically go over the walls. This provides all the mortar joints. It highlights high lights and darks and things like that. But the final step in this is I lay all the building walls flat, like this one, and then I go over it with alcohol and India ink. And I let it puddle. So you get dark and light spots on the wall that looks a lot like weathering. And it really turns out well. The building on the upper right, this was a building I got at a swap meet for $3, whatever. And I used these techniques on it. All I need now is an interior, which I'll describe that later. Again, I said I used colored pencils. Early on, I've kind of abandoned that. You can sponge paint these various brick colors far easier than you can use colored pencils. But again, you can also use a light gray off-white wash for mortar color. It's not quite as effective as the spackle or the joint compound, but it is still a good opportunity. And you can actually also use chalk. You can use white chalk ground up and then spread over the walls. And then again, finish with alcohol and India ink. So some other things that'll set your buildings apart from the norm, signs, awning, scratch-built wood loading docks, all add uniqueness to your structures. This is a simple kit that I have had in a box for a long time. We have good friends. He's a Safeway store director, and his last name is Betts. So I honored him with this little grocery store up in my mining community of Doyle. If you want to take it a step further and you really want to set these buildings apart, you go and do interiors and lighting. So here are a series of buildings that I have made for my city of Matheson, and I have scratch built the interiors. This is Norge Appliance Store. I built stoves, dishwashers, refrigerators, etc., washers and dryers, all in the interior. This is Taylor Insurance. A good friend of mine runs an insurance company in Longview, and this is his insurance company building. There's filing cabinets along one wall. What I try and do when I have a entry hall door like this one, I try and put the wall toward the main part of the building so I can run all the lighting wiring behind it. This is Martin's furniture store. Again, this was a building I've had sitting around for a long time. Somebody had built and done a iffy job, so I redid it. The top floor is all bedding. I made bunk beds, king size beds, queen size beds, etc., all upstairs. And there's a stairway down from the upstairs into the main floor, and it has dining room tables, sofas, love seats, couches, etc. And it again is all lighted both floors. On the right, this is Romo's Pizza. There's a counter back here with a pizza waiting on it and a guy ordering. And all these red and white checkered tables are in there. The red and white checker tables are basically reduced photocopies of a red and white checker pattern and put over styrene tables that I made. You want to really get into it? There you go. In my town of Matheson, it's about 12 feet long, and it's got a main road that runs down behind the staging yards and the main lines. I was originally going to have the backs of all the buildings facing that staging yard and main lines, but my friends convinced me that it would be far more interesting to have the fronts of buildings facing the aisle where people can see, and then interiors in each one. This is Matheson Steakhouse, along with the Taps Tavern. There are two separate interiors. One's a tavern with beer, with actual beer on the table. These are people waiting for their steaks. And again, here's Roma's Pizza. And then Carey's Automotive Parts. My cousin's last name was Carey, and he was an incredible automotive person, so I honored him with an automotive parts store. This is the second block. Again, this is Taylor Insurance Company, as I showed you earlier. And again, Nord Appliance Stores. This building I built, but has yet to have an interior put in. I've got two different stores that can go in, and another corner building. This is B's Dress Shop. It has an interior with people shopping, tables with clothing on them, display windows on each side with mannequins, basically HO figures with the heads cut off. And then here's the furniture store. This is a building that I built at the last spring meet. Jack Hamilton ran a clinic on building these buildings. And so this was my creation. And I basically took a photo of an interior of a building and put it in here, kind of curved it into the front of the building. And it actually turned out pretty well. And then of course, townhouses. These townhouses were built and treated just like the other brick buildings that I've shown you previously. And then this is the City Block 4. You'll get an idea of what the roads and streets look like. I think I might have done a clinic on this earlier. This too has an interior. This building is waiting for an interior. And you can get an idea what I'm talking about the black divider, because you look in this second window in from this building and you can see the back. You can see through the lower window of the back. So that's what we want to avoid with that black interior divider. So please remember, your layout doesn't have to appear toy-like. Take some extra time on your structures, paint everything. It'll be well worth it. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. That was an outstanding clinic.
And again, these are not the only techniques you can use. This is just kind of my way of trying to make it look good.
You can come over and build my buildings for me all the time, Greg.
Thank you, Paul. I think I still have a few of my own to build.
Remember, a lot of these buildings built in at the turn of the century, the 10s and 20s, would have had elevators that could have handled cars, because often they would have activities using vehicles on the second level. Those cranky old elevators with the grating on them. Remember those?
Oh yeah. And
so you need a house up on top of the roof to manage that.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. I'll step back a minute. All these buildings that I built, the DPM buildings for Matheson, I basically got from an estate sale at about $4 or $5 a piece. They're fine. They're wonderful. They're, you know, the little, like, again, a little extra effort, and they stand out. So.
No, these are great buildings.
Thank you.
Greg, what's your favorite way of doing vines?
It's just a simple micro brush with glue, tacky glue preferably, because it sticks pretty well. And I just draw little, you know, vine shapes up the side of the building, especially on the corners if you get a bad corner. And then I basically sprinkle Woodland Scenic fine ground foam over them, pat it down, and that's that.
Greg, in your buildings that you've purchased and are intact, have you ever attempted to cut them up?
Yeah, Paul, I've been tempted. It's just right now, it was a matter of just populating Matheson with as many buildings as I could get. I've done that with other buildings, some factories and things like that. But the city structures you could easily take the middle or the top story out and reduce it to a one-story building. It would be very easy to do that. It's just nothing. I guess I'm going to have to do that and do a clinic.
At the museum, we had a bunch of mostly residential structures that were donated, and they were already built and fairly well glued together. And instead of trying to disassemble them to turn them into flats, which is what I was interested in, using them, I just got a really fine-toothed plywood saw and ran them through my table saw. Of course, you have to be careful when you're doing that because when you're dealing with styrene, it tends to melt. But if you put some blocking in it so that it's kind of supported, and you watch your fingers and so forth, you can actually cleave some of these buildings in half. With a little bit of practice. You don't win every time you try it. It's a thought. If anybody's got some already built structures that you'd like to just take the end off of it, for instance, to fit it in a place, that is a consideration. You could probably do it with a bandsaw. You might be able
Sure.
to do that as well.
Yeah, and again, the one thing I pointed out earlier is take photocopies of the building you're going to work with, and then you can cut the pieces up and try and fit them together, and you're not going to ruin the kit ahead of time. You can actually create, like you said, Paul, different sizes, shapes, and then cut the actual building kit.
Yeah, one of the other things that we ran across is sometimes these buildings, these kits that you get, they have roofing that is more European in style.
Yes.
Where tile roofs instead of a shingle or a shake roof. And you can use the low wattage soldering iron technique that I've mentioned in some of the clinics that I've given to modify the styrene. It just has to be thick enough that you don't end up plowing right through it. That's all. Yeah. And you can also add texture to some of those otherwise really smooth, chunky looking walls. You can actually add concrete form lines on those as well to give them a little bit more character, particularly if they're an industrial building where it wasn't necessarily going to be a perfect look anyway.
A neat technique I saw too was taking the side and back walls of the DPM buildings and cut irregular shapes with Scotch tape and put them on the walls, and then spray it with, I think it's called concrete paint or whatever. It's a texture paint.
Right.
And it basically becomes stucco on the wall. And then you peel off the masking tape or painter's tape, whatever, and you've got the brick then where the stucco has, quote, fallen off. And that's a great addition to a building as well.
Well, they make artist mask as well, would allow you to daub little spots on there so that it would look a little bit more realistic than what you could probably do just with tape. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Good idea.
Absolutely. The nice thing about roofs is you can do whatever you want to. The roofing material that comes with the DPM buildings is really thin, really flexible, and it doesn't support well. So I always replace it with a thicker styrene piece. And then, of course, treat it with whatever roofing material or technique I want to use.
Well, your comments about reinforcing joints and so forth is very appropriate for most of these structures because they tend to flex. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if nothing else, all four sides, where the roof would sit in. And I do the same thing with the second floor. So I'll put the supports above where the second floor comes up. So it'll be the roof of the first floor, the ceiling of the first floor. And I put all my lighting then in there. What I use for lighting is LED strip. It's 12 volts. Usually I use 3 at a time for the interiors of these buildings. I've used more when it's a larger kit. The strip lighting you can get off of Amazon for minimal amounts of money, and it goes a long, long way.
Speaking of building wiring, what do you use for your power supply?
I use an old dual pack, MRC dual pack, and I have a fixed DC port in the back, and I hook up I have bus wires. So this is the other thing I've done, and I haven't completed it because it's been a low priority. But I bought electrical bus panels, whatever you want to call them. You hook the 2 buses in, and then they have multiple places to hook your building wires in. So you run 12 volts in and you run 12 volts out to probably 10 different buildings in each location. So I have 5. I have 1 for each city that I have lights in all the buildings, and they'll eventually have the wiring running into those buses, and then all the buildings will be lit up.
So you're basically not using anything fancy, just
No.
plain old 12-volt DC.
Well, here's the deal. I bought some of the Walthers plug-in light. What is it?
Plug and play, I guess.
Their modular lighting system. So they have cars and they have buildings and they have lights and pole lights and all this kind of stuff. So I bought a bunch of that.
Woodland Scenics.
Oh, it's Woodland Scenics. Thank you. Thank you. It is. It's Woodland Scenics. But the interesting part is I spent a fortune and I just don't have that much to show for it. I probably will use some of it for street lights. I've got pole lights that'll be for industrial areas. But beyond that, you go on eBay and you can find lighting up the wazoo. I mean, there's so many different things you can find between street lights and hook lights for buildings. It's just really a neat way to enhance your buildings.
You might consider looking online for lighthouse LEDs. They're out of Spokane, and okay. They've helped us out.
I haven't heard of that, Paul. That's a good idea.
Yeah, the other folks, which is a little bit more expensive, but they're a little bit fancier setup, is the outfit out of Colorado, Evans Design.
I think I have gotten some things from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They've got some cool stuff. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things you guys people can do for their structures, and it's just taking a little extra time to do it to make them less toy-like.
You have a lot of basement windows.
Yes.
Were those cut off the tops of buildings?
No, they were actually part of the kit, Bob.
Okay. Have you thought about making window wells for some of the buildings just to set them apart from same look, same window?
That's a great idea. No, I haven't, but thank you.
Old school, a wooden well, or new school, corrugated. They almost look like half a tub, corrugated tub.
And there's several buildings that I have on the layout that have, you know, the half basement windows, and that would be very appropriate.
They don't all look like the same kit.
Yeah, you bet.
The other thing is, if you thought about leaving garbage on the roof, the roofer guys didn't take all their buckets down.
I've got a couple of situations where I've got roof patches where they've put tar down, and I've got one crew working on top of Diamond Brewery repairing the roof on the Sky Bridge. Yeah, there's things like that. I mean, you can leave pieces of wood, you can leave all sorts of stuff up there. So the more junk, I think, the better.
It's a great place to hide stuff, or if you think you're going to store it on the roof, like the old rusty air conditioner.
Yeah.
It may never come down, but the new one's sitting right beside it, purring away.
Nice. You know, Walthers has put out a lot of neat detail things like air conditioners and piping and stuff like that. So you just take some time with those and add them to your kits. It'd be great.
You could also, if you had a school building, a high school building, put an old VW up there, and because that's what we did in our school.
Well, ours was a cow.
Oh,
ours was a cow. So yeah.
couple of kites or balls that got thrown on the roof.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff. You know, that's the deal. Knock yourself out. Go for it. Just do what strikes you as being funny and interesting, and yeah, do it. It's all good.
Since we're on the subject of roofs, anybody know any nifty tricks for dealing with exposed rafter tails on the eaves that avoids having to cut dozens of little short pieces and glue them up in perfect location?
That's exactly what I do. Sorry, that's not the answer you wanted.
You make a master and then a rubber mold and cast them in resin.
Or find somebody with a 3D printer that can do it for you.
I did this on a wooden model where I took a piece of basswood and I sawed out the spaces between the rafters. And so that gave me many rafters. I don't know if that was any less time consuming and a struggle than actually taking the sticks and gluing them on. One of the things I did find, though, when you cut wood like that, you know, because it's going to be going with the grain, is that any moisture in there, any humidity change, that thing would behave like a piece of cardboard in terms of it being wavy. So it wasn't particularly successful, and I had to do something else eventually.
One of the things, when I built some of my wooden structures and they had rafter tails, I would take the cardboard roof and of course paint the underside, turn it over and mark with a pencil the spacing for all the rafter tails. And then I would use my chopper and set the angle correctly and just sit and chop a bunch of these things and then turn the building over, and I'd know exactly where to line up the edge next to the wall and go ahead and just start gluing them down. I glue the whole things. Then I would turn it over and put it back on the building. For the most part, it worked out pretty well. Not always, but for the most part.
Well, you can always put a fascia board along the outer edge. Here and there it works, but if not consistently around a layout.
No, and yeah, you do that on occasional buildings, but then use the rafter tails for, those special buildings that'll be up front and visible.
Does anybody remember wooden gutters from the 50s and earlier?
I'm not that old. Sorry.
Greg, I don't know why I never thought of it, but I like the idea of taking the cheap spray paint. And if it sounded like you were saying spraying the entire inside walls of the building with the cheaper spray paint. I've always done that with, like, when I've done it, when it's a small building, I've used like a magic marker, which is really super tedious, or something. Or when it's the bigger ones, I've done it with my airbrush, but I don't know why I never thought of doing it with like a rattle can. Much faster thing to do.
It really is, Larry. And it's you basically, once your walls are all cut and ready to be assembled, that's the first thing I do. I turn them all over, spray them with black spray paint, let it dry, and then I turn them over to the front side, and then I spray the actual wall color I want on top of that. The wall color is just, again, a cheap rattle can. I mean, I use the camouflage line you can get at McClendon's, and I think all of them, to be honest with you. And they work out really well. It's just really good. And then if it's a red brick building, that's when I go back with the sponge and acrylic paints, and then the spackle and gray paint mortar.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that you said quickly, Greg, but I hope everybody picked up on, is that these buildings will glow if you put light on the inside of them, unless you do a light blocker. And that black paint on the inside, particularly if it's a good significant coat, will help stop that sort of silliness. When you do all of this nice stuff and you put a light in, you go, oh my goodness, I've got light leaks around the edges and, and all that sort of stuff. So,
or this glowing red brick building.
Yeah. And it is particularly weird when it just glows in some areas and not others.
Yeah, very true. So I'm going to see if I can show this to you. This is a presentation I did on building wooden buildings. And that's the eave under the building that I did. And it's basically strip wood cut with the chopper and then glued at regular intervals underneath the eave. And yeah, it takes some time, but the results is pretty darn good.
Cool. Well, Greg, thank you very much for your clinic. I really appreciate it. And it was a great clinic.
Well, thank you very much.